I'm Gloria Palmer, the Executive Director of Green Mountain Academy for Lifelong Learning, and it is with great pleasure that I introduce this afternoon's speaker. Professor Dirk Vandewalle is an Associate Professor of Government at Dartmouth College and the author of 2 internationally acclaimed books on Libya. As the crisis in Libya deepened last year, he was the most sought-after person by virtually all media outlets in the U.S. and across the world. He has been interviewed by all major global newspapers and is considered the world's leading expert in the West on Libya. It is a real honor to have him here, taking time out of his very busy schedule. Please give a warm welcome to Dirk Vandewalle.
Thank you so much, Gloria, and thank you for that warm welcome. And thank you all for coming out on this very hot afternoon. I'm surprised there's no phone cell service here in parts of your town, but I was coming in because I was a little bit late. As Gloria said, I've spent an enormous amount of time over the last, not only the last few years, I've actually spent professionally about 30 years of my life in the Middle East. And so when Gloria asked me to talk about an Arab Spring, or what is called the Arab Upheaval, I was delighted to do so, and I do this in a number of settings, both for Dartmouth and for non-Dartmouth groups, and so I'm really delighted to be here and hopefully help you think through some of the intricacies of what is going on in the Middle East and what is currently also going on, obviously, in Syria. Although we've seen over the last few days perhaps the most stunning news has really come out of Egypt, where the military has summarily done away with just about everything that has happened since the revolution started in Egypt last year. And so I'll try to give you a little bit of background to the conflict, and then after about 45 minutes or so, I'll open it up for questions, and please don't be shy. I realize I'll try to kind of target my talk as much as possible to a non-specialist audience, and if I do kind of transgress and if I start saying things you don't comprehend, please raise your hand by all means and ask me what exactly I mean. The Middle East is a very, very complicated place with lots of different ethnic groups, lots of different religious groups, and you almost have to be somebody professionally involved to really understand what all is going on and kind of speculate where all of this is going. The events that started in December 2010, the first political upheaval that started in Tunisia in December 2010, really was the first of a number of popular revolutions that we've seen in the Middle East, and really the first ones for the last 40, 45, 50 years or so. And I won't have time today to tell you kind of a little bit about the historical background of the Middle East, but periodically we've seen throughout the emergence of the modern Middle East in the aftermath of independence. And remember that most of the countries in the Middle East, and for my purpose here, I'll include in the Middle East also North Africa, which is also normally included in part because the countries Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, and then North Africa, and Egypt, of course, although physically located in North Africa, speak Arabic and really have an Arab tradition. And ever since the uprising started, it has been referred to by a number of different names, and you've probably seen some of those. It's been referred to as the Arab Revolt, and that is really a throwback to a term that was used in the 1910s, 1916, 1917, when you may remember Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia was in charge of what was called the Arab Revolt, which was an uprising of the Arabs against the Ottoman Empire at the time. And so for lots of reasons, the term Arab Revolt has kind of stuck, and it was used over the last few months for that purpose as well, in connection with what we've seen in the Middle East. It's sometimes also called the Arab Upheaval, and I think one of the one of the most interesting titles that I've heard that it has been named at has been the Arab Spring. The notion, of course, that in spring, things grow and blossom and so on, and that this really represented in the Arab world a kind of a blossoming of popular politics. And as I always kind of skeptically say, if this was the Arab Spring, looking at it 2 years later, to use the old title of the song of Pete Seeger, where have all the flowers gone? And in a sense, that is not such an outrageous subtitle for a talk, because what we've seen so far, I would argue, has been some moderate progress forward in terms of moving these countries toward what we in the West would like to see as democracy, although one of the arguments I will try to make later on, or will be glad to respond to if you have a question on it, is that democracy in the Middle East, in the kind of setting of the Middle East, at least the kind of Westminster-style democracy that we in the West take for granted, I think is a very, very difficult notion in the Middle East, and we shouldn't expect it to really be implemented for a number of reasons that have both to do with the region, but also have to do with an issue of timing. Democracies usually need a good chunk of time before they really develop, institutionally speaking, into democracies. Well, when that uprising started, or the first uprising that we saw in Tunisia in December 2010, it was led, you've probably seen pictures or heard the young man's name, by a young fruit seller, vegetable seller in Tunisia called Mohamed Bouazizi. And Mohamed Bouazizi had been trying, as many young kind of underemployed, unemployed young Tunisians, to get a permit to sell some vegetables by the side of the market in one of the cities, one of the small cities of Tunisia, in a kind of a usual fashion, very kind of telling for what the political climate was like at the time in the country, had been either refused that permit on some days, and when he reapplied, had been slapped around by one of the policemen. In part, it is alleged because he didn't pay the bribe or a big enough bribe to really get a permit for that day. And then Mohamed Bouazizi, as a result of that, totally frustrated by not only that day, what had happened that day, but also his life, in which many, many Tunisians like him simply cannot find work, unemployment in Tunisia, in Egypt, in lots of the countries that I'll talk about, hovers anywhere between 20 and 50%. And in frustration against all that, then set himself on fire. And became, by doing that, kind of the martyr, the example of what this Arab Spring, in a sense, has been all about. And I'd like to kind of introduce a sentence that, particularly if I said it at Dartmouth, people are always a little taken back when I say it. It's a very small quotation from Vladimir Lenin. And Lenin knew a lot about revolutions. He'd been involved with one of the major revolutions of the world, obviously. And Lenin, in one of his notebooks, wrote, there are decades when nothing happens, and then there are weeks when decades happen. And what he meant to convey, of course, was that these popular revolutions, as he was talking about the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, then of course the imposition of the Soviet rule and what became the Soviet Union, what he was trying to convey is that it takes relatively long periods of time before you get to a tipping point where some of these revolutions actually become actual revolutions. You get lots of little protests, but there have to be certain tipping points, usually developing over long, long periods of time. And certainly if you think about Tunisia, what you saw was, frustration. Frustration because of a political system that if you go back thinking about Tunisia, Tunisia was one of the best examples of a modern state that emerged in the Middle East. And for those of you who are a little bit older, you may remember that at the time, and this is 1956, when Tunisia became independent, it was headed by a man called Habib Bourguiba. And Bourguiba was, like many of his contemporaries at the time, trained in the West. He was a lawyer, had been to the Sorbonne in Paris, had gotten his law degree there, had went back to Tunisia, and had led the movement of independence starting in the 1930s, and it took roughly 30 years or so. But the point was that independence movement in Tunisia in particular had really been a kind of a very modern movement. It had really been very concerned about the rule of law. It had been concerned about political expression, institutional mechanisms for political expression, and so on. And so, in a sense, when Tunisia became independent in 1956, it was really kind of the best example that we could think of. As a matter of fact, it was referred to for a long, long time in the region as the pays pilote in French, you know, the guiding light, so to speak, for similar movements. And Tunisia remained kind of this pays pilote for almost 25 years or so, guided by Habib Bourguiba, and in very typical fashion, because Bourguiba had been brought up in a Western educational system in Paris, he introduced into Tunisia a number of what were very, very radical changes at the time. And one of the changes he introduced was, it was still the custom in Tunisia at the time that the men wore the traditional fezzes, you know, which was a remnant of the Ottoman Empire. Bourguiba said, you know, enough of these fezzes, you know, that's the Ottoman Empire, that's not really us. We're modern Tunisians, we don't do this. The other thing he did was, during the month of Ramadan, when Muslims usually fast from sunrise to sunset, Bourguiba went on national television and publicly during Ramadan drank a glass of orange juice. And what he was trying to convey was, you know, look, if we really want to develop, if we really want to kind of pull ourselves up by our bootstraps economically, and these kinds of religious injunctions that exist here in the Middle East aren't really very good for us. We need to do away with it. You can imagine that raised some ruckus in, you know, what was still a pretty traditional country at the time. But the issue that perhaps raised the most trouble for Bourguiba, but also was perhaps his most signal achievement, was really women's emancipation. And when when Tunisia became independent in 1956, most Tunisian women were still dressed very traditionally, the equivalent of what today we would call the burqa, had absolutely no standing in personal law. They were completely dependent on their husbands, could summarily be divorced by their husband. And so Bourguiba, again thinking of kind of the legal state that he wanted to bring about in Tunisia, abolished that. And as I said, this kind of the legal state, the French have a wonderful term for that, état de droit, meaning a state, you know, where law and transparency and so on really have a value. That state lasted for about 25 years. And Bourguiba, kind of an exemplar of modernity, became very much a kind of a highly authoritarian figure. He became president time after time again, and then finally one time he just decided he wanted to do away with all these legal niceties, and he just became president for life. And of course, you know, we've seen that all throughout the Arab world and the Middle East, and all of the countries where we're seeing contestation today. As a matter of fact, most of the countries, think of Egypt, think of Syria, think of Morocco, etc., think of Bahrain, have all had these kind of what we now call political dynasties, you know, that power devolves from the father to the son. And in Tunisia, because it had had this relatively long period of modernization, the kind of changes that took place after roughly 1980 were really very jarring. Tunisia became a highly authoritative country headed by a general called Azzedine Ben Ali, and in a sense Tunisia became a very good example of a police state, and a police state that privileged certainly those that that wanted to participate with the major figures of the regime. And so you saw created in Tunisia something we've seen throughout the Middle East, whether it's Egypt, whether it's Syria again, and that is a large bifurcation between those that became rich, in part because they cooperated with the regime, and those that remained poor and became poorer over time as the years went by. At the same time, the kind of political rights that Tunisians had under Bourguiba were abolished by the Ben Ali regime. Some of the achievements for women, including the Ministry for Women's Affairs that had been created under Bourguiba, was also done away with. And so in a sense, if you want to explain what happened to this young man, Bouazizi, in a sense you have to understand that there was this long lead-up time to what in a sense he did. There was a young man from a generation who really had no future in Tunisia, and it had no future in light of what had happened in the last 20, 25, 30 years or so. And so even though we tend to think of Bouazizi as kind of a unicum, somebody who stands alone, in many ways he represented very much not only young Tunisians, but also, and this is the larger point I would like to make, he really represented very much young people all over the Middle East. Young people who couldn't get jobs even in Saudi Arabia, which is one of the richest countries in the world. Unemployment is very, very high. Underemployment is estimated roughly 40 to 50%. So the same kind of phenomenon that we found in this young man in Bouazizi in Tunisia, you can find throughout the Arab world. It is on the one hand political exclusion, and it's on the other hand also the fact that those that participate with the regime become richer. Those that rise up in opposition, that do not want to partake of these elites that are guiding the country, and very tiny elites in most of these countries. Think of Saudi Arabia. You have a royal family. I mean, think of Saudi Arabia in a sense, as a family business. That's in a sense really what it is. And so there's that on the one hand, the gradual exclusion that then inevitably led, to the kind of defiance that we saw throughout the Arab world. And if Tunisia was the first example, and in Tunisia, for all practical purposes, is really, a very small country. It's really within inter-Arab politics, except for the period under Bourguiba, it's not been such a terribly important country. But the second example of where this Arab revolution took place was Egypt. Now, Egypt, of course, is a whole different ballgame, in part because Egypt has really played for a very long time the guiding role in inter-Arab politics. And if you, again, for those of you who are a little bit older, you may remember going back all the way to 1952 when Gamal Abdel Nasser, the military commander, took over the reins in Egypt and then led his country again, and we'll find this again throughout the Middle East, on what he called a kind of a modernization and an economic development strategy, kind of symbolized in a little book he wrote called The Philosophy of the Revolution. And what we saw, of course, was that none of what Nasser wanted to do, to create a strong state, to create a strong economy, to give people a political voice, really happened. And Nasser, much like Bourguiba, kind of in frustration, increasingly turned autocratic also. And so the military in Egypt became the most powerful institution in the country. Now, this was not coincidental. Gamal Abdel Nasser, as part of his strategy for developing the country, for developing Egypt, had promised all young Egyptians that they were entitled to a university education. And even though a lot of these young people simply were intellectually not capable of handling being at the university, but it became kind of a right. And within a few years after Gamal Abdel Nasser had started his revolution in 1952, there were, because Egypt, of course, had a large number of universities. Remember, Egypt is a very, very big country, roughly 60 to 65 million people, an enormous territory. Well, within a few years after Gamal Abdel Nasser had come to power, Egypt was producing an excess of roughly 500,000 young men and women who had graduated from the university, and of course for whom there was no job whatsoever. Now, if you push this forward a little, about 10 years, by the time you get to just the period before Nasser died in 1970, Egypt already had a backlog of roughly an estimated 10 million people, 10 million young people who had no job whatsoever. And more importantly, that very likely would never have a job in their life, because Egypt was not creating any jobs at all. As a matter of fact, that is really one of the major difficulties of the Arab world today, is that it's incapable of producing, creating enough jobs for the unemployed that it has. And so when Nasser died then in 1970, the regime was taken over, not so surprisingly, by one of his confidants, Anwar Sadat. And Sadat, of course, was also a military figure and very quickly kind of maintained and then extended these highly authoritarian policies that Nasser had implemented. And then when Sadat eventually, who was assassinated, you may remember, by an Islamist, and I'll come back to the Islamists a little bit later on because they play a unique role, in a sense, in this Arab upheaval that I'm talking about. When Sadat died, he was, the position of president was assumed by Hosni Mubarak. You're probably all following the news as we speak. He is now either dead or virtually dead in a coma in one of the military hospitals in Egypt. Mubarak was always referred to in Egypt as the pharaoh, this figure that was immensely powerful. And again, in very, very typical fashion, the Mubarak family had enriched itself and its friends immeasurably at the expense of the average Egyptian. And so when the uprising took place in Egypt, it was quite different, quite different, at least somewhat different from what had happened in Tunisia. Remember what I told you about Tunisia. You had this long history of what I will call here state building under Bourguiba, creations of a modern state, or created the army as an institution in Tunisia. It's independent. Well, in Egypt, things looked slightly different. The military in Egypt, which again was the power broker in the uprising that started, the military in itself had really become a power in itself. And of course, Mubarak had belonged to the military. And the military in Egypt had really insinuated itself not only into the political life, but also into the economic life. Roughly 40% of all goods and services in Egypt are produced by the military. And so the military is, not only a political force to be reckoned with, it's also a large economic force. And hence why many observers, when the Egyptian revolution took place, were very, very skeptical. The argument was always that the military had so many economic interests, leave alone the political interests of reforming the system, that they would never actually do so. And of course, what we saw in Egypt was astounding. We saw, you've probably all seen on CNN or any of the international broadcasters, these enormous scenes of people gathering in Maidan Tahrir, Revolution Square, in Cairo, unprecedented and really unheard of. Because even if you would have went to Cairo, a few months before this uprising started, you would have seen that Egyptians were really perpetually cowed in face of the regime. There was no political uprising. As a matter of fact, there were quite a few political prisoners. Anybody who dared raise their voices, including some very well-connected people, found themselves very quickly in jail or had to leave the country. And so suddenly the revolt took place. And again, interestingly enough, it was the young people in Egypt that took up the baton, so to speak, for this new revolution. It was the young people who demonstrated. It was women who participated for the first time, because again, women had really, although Egypt has some women in political parties and so on, the representation had been relatively low, but certainly women were very heavily involved in the uprising that started. And again, you've probably seen some of these pictures, night after night, these literally hundreds of thousands of demonstrators against the regime then trying to overthrow that popular revolution by bringing its thugs and the military police and so on to Tahrir Square and to the other cities in Cairo, and being unable to do so. And the tipping point in Egypt really came not so much because of the popular protests, although those were important, but the tipping point really came when the military, and remember that the military in Egypt is also very heavily supported by the United States. Egypt is the second-ranked country in terms of military contribution that the United States donates to. The first one is Israel. The second one is Egypt. We give Egypt $1.3 billion every year for its military. As a matter of fact, despite the fact that it looked as if the military was not going to give up power, we released that 1.3 million again a few weeks ago to the Egyptian military. But what was clear in Egypt to the military was that the Mubarak regime was in trouble. And it was clear that the international sponsors of the regime, particularly the United States, would not support the kind of human rights violations that had been going on as the demonstrations took place night after night. And when the military realized that the game was up, so to speak, for Mubarak, they changed their tune. They threw their lot in, at least temporarily, with the popular protesters against the regime, with the young people. And we saw a long and protracted period in which the military engaged in some kind of dialogue with political figures, with some of the young people in Egypt, kept promising to open up the political system, kept promising that they would write a constitution, that constitution would be popularly ratified, etc. All the kind of the language that you need to hear to think about a political system opening up. And then, as I said a few days ago, in a very dramatic, although perhaps not unexpected fashion, the military suddenly realizing that they actually may really lose power, in part because what really sparked this was the fact that the Islamist candidate for president really was elected. And saw the military, saw the writing on the wall, stepped in, abolished whatever had been accomplished so far, said that it would write the constitution itself, disbanded the National Assembly, and downgraded the power of the president, of the newly elected president in Egypt, obviously, so that their own role would not be affected. So my kind of thinking about Egypt is that we're likely to see a lot more popular uprisings over the next few weeks and months, confronting once again the military, and since the military in a sense is now pushed into a corner and has relatively little to lose anymore, that perhaps that struggle will be even more violent than what we've seen so far in Egypt. Now, the one country, and as Gloria said, I've spent an enormous amount of time in Libya, and I'm going back to Libya next week with the Carter Center people to monitor the elections that are taking place in Libya. And Libya, of course, has been a fascinating, I mean, personally, of course, for me, but I think overall a very fascinating place to watch, in part because I think there really was the expectation that this person called Muammar al-Gaddafi was simply too powerful to be overthrown. And indeed, I must say, I was interviewed by NPR 3 days before the uprising in Libya started, and Flintock, the interviewer, asked me, "Do you think this is likely to happen in Libya?" And I said, "No, this is just impossible. This is such a powerful regime." And there we were, 3 days afterwards, the uprising in Benghazi started, and again, led by young people. But what was very interesting, and why the Libyan situation took so long. Remember, the struggle, in a sense, in Egypt was over within a month or so. The struggle in Tunisia within the same period of time. But in Libya, the situation really devolved into an actual civil war. And a lot of that had to do with the history of the country. This is a country that has never truly been united. You may remember, again, some of you, that Libya was created at the behest of the great powers after World War II, particularly the United States and Great Britain, because we needed strategic military bases in the territory that became Libya, and so we were willing to sponsor it before the United Nations General Assembly as an independent country, and we kind of strong-armed the Russians and the Chinese in not vetoing the application before the Security Council at the time also. And so, in a sense, it has a lot to do with the history of Libya, but of course, it has an enormous amount, the outcome has an enormous amount to do as well with the policy of Gaddafi. And Gaddafi, for those of you who don't remember, came to power in 1969, and for 42 years, if you thought of Egypt and Tunisia as authoritarian, Libya was really kind of on the verge of almost totalitarian. This was truly a country where you couldn't speak out, where the least bit of criticism would land you or your family in serious trouble, lots of human rights violations, lots of incidences of torture and so on. And you may remember that it was one of these incidents in 1996, the shooting of 1,200 innocent prisoners at one of the prisons inside Tripoli, the Abu Salim prison, that in a sense led indirectly to the uprising last year. And that is the man who had defended some of these, the families of some of the prisoners that had been shot at the Abu Salim prison, was a human rights activist who kept pressing the government in an unprecedented way for settling some of these claims in favor of the families that had lost sons or husbands in the shooting at the Abu Salim prison. And when that lawyer, who was nationally known by that time, was then picked up, that sparked the young people to go to the courthouse in Benghazi where he had been picked up and start that revolution. And again, no one really thought that this would go anywhere. And I remember talking to a very close friend who was very high up in the government in Libya and asking her, she was in Morocco where I was at the time, and kind of saying, what do you think is going to happen? And she also, kind of said, this is just going to last a couple of 2-3 days, then everything is going to be back to normal. But some very interesting things happened in Benghazi at the time, and one of the very interesting ones was that this young woman who was with me in Morocco, her father was actually one of the so-called revolutionary command council leaders, one of the men who had taken power, grabbed power in 1969 with Gaddafi. And when Gaddafi, he is the military commander of the eastern side of Libya, when the military commander, when Gaddafi called him and said, I want you to move your troops against those protesters in the state, this man, Suleiman Mahmoud al-Obeidi, refused to do so. And in a sense, it was this crucial refusal that then gave enough power to the young people who were demonstrating to really move very rapidly against the regime, being able to overtake one of the military garrisons, one of the most important military garrisons in Benghazi and in Libya. And then the revolution, of course, spread very rapidly. But of course, the regime remained very powerful, and it remained powerful because of a development that was very, very different from Egypt and Tunisia. Remember that in Egypt and Tunisia, I told you, you had a military that could really kind of manipulate things, that could act as a buffer between the population and between the actual regime. In Libya, you didn't have this. Libya never really had a professional army, in part because Gaddafi himself, coming out of a military background, had never really trusted the military. And so the military consisted of brigades that were directly responsible to Gaddafi. And so when the revolution started in Libya, some of these brigades remained loyal to Gaddafi, some of them defected to the opposition. And so the result of that really was a civil war. Lots and lots, the figures aren't in yet, but the estimates on human life lost in Libya during the uprising was perhaps as much as 40 to 50,000, which will pale compared to the next country I'll talk about. But of course, then in October last year, finally, the opposition caught up with Gaddafi, and undoubtedly you've probably seen some pictures of that very brutal execution of Gaddafi that took place at that time. And ever since then, and my primary task working for the United Nations was really to start to help to figure out with the current regime, which is a transitional regime, some of the first kind of institutions to help create some of the first institutions that this country that really has no history of being unified as a country, acting as a unified country, now faces in dealing with all kinds of problems. And of course, the elections that are coming up on the 7th of July in Libya will really be the first, but I think a crucial threshold for Libya, because it's really the first time that Libyans, for all practical purposes, will have had the right to vote. And even though there's quite a bit of, not surprisingly, infighting between different parties, in a sense, it is a very important step forward, because at least it means that Libyans can agree on setting that step forward, setting a step forward toward to creating kind of a modern state in Libya, something that the country has never seen. Now, I come next to a country that, of course, is very much in the news also, and that is Syria. And you may wonder, I get asked this all the time, why it is that in Libya we saw the international community intervene. Indeed, the Libyan conflict could not have been finished without international intervention. It was really the crucial role that NATO played that allowed the opponents of the Gaddafi regime to really move forward and to be successful. And of course, we have not seen that in Syria at all. We've not seen any intervention whatsoever. And the reason for that is that when the Libyan matter came before the United Nations adopted two distinct resolutions, 1970 and 1973. And under those resolutions, there was a consensus that was adopted within the Security Council that the international community had the right to intervene to protect civilians in Libya. And of course, that was the entry point at which NATO then went into Libya, and of course eventually drove the Gaddafi regime from power. Now, in that whole process, the crucial aspect had really been to convince Russia and China to not veto a resolution against the resolution 1973 in particular. And it took about 3 weeks of very intense negotiation between particularly the United States, France, Great Britain, and then China and Russia. And ultimately, China and Russia abstained from voting in the Security Council, allowing the resolution to move forward. Now, remember that the resolution said that the international community could protect civilians from attacks, from imminent attack levied against it by the Gaddafi regime. Russia has always argued, and I think Russia is actually quite correct, that NATO has gone far beyond the mandate that it was assigned under that resolution. In other words, NATO very deliberately became proactive. It was not simply protecting civilians anymore, it actively went after the Gaddafi supporters. And so what Russia is now arguing is that this was a dismal mistake on the part of NATO and on the part of the United Nations. And so when there was a request made to intervene, that is a request made at the United Nations for a similar resolution against Syria, the Russians, and you may have heard Mr. Lavrov speaking over the last couple of days, has made it very, very clear that that kind of resolution simply will not take place, that Russia will veto any attempt to settle the Syrian conflict. Now, remember, Russia has a long-standing relationship with Syria. It had some kind of relationship with Libya also, but not a terribly important one. But the relationship between Russia and Syria is much deeper than it ever was with Syria. The Russians also have a deep water harbor out of the Syrian coast, so the situation is very different. Now, what is happening internally in Syria is, of course, also very different. And that is Syria, much like Libya, but in a very different fashion, was also an artificial creation after World War II. In Syria, you have two distinct, well, you have more than two, but you have at least two distinct groups that have been at each other's throats intermittently since independence, although that being at each other's throat was held in abeyance by usually by the military in the country. But what is interesting in Syria is that you have a distinction between Shiite Muslims and Sunni Muslims. And the minority that has ruled the country, and very interestingly enough, the reason the minority has ruled that country is because the French, during the colonial period, gave that minority political power and put it in power. That minority, called the Alawites, of which, of course, President Bashar and his family is a member, have ruled the country with an iron fist at the expense of the majority, which are actually Sunni Muslims in that country. And of course, Syria then also has a number of Christians and so on. So what really started off, like in the other countries, as a kind of a popular revolt, has very quickly devolved into an almost sectarian strife in Libya between, in Syria between these different groups. And so for Syria, I think the situation looks much more difficult and much more long-lasting. First of all, because I think it's very unlikely that we'll see international intervention in Syria. We may eventually see some of it, perhaps because of the Arab League weighing in for some kind of troops. Perhaps eventually the United Nations will have some kind of resolution, but certainly the Russians, again reiterated yesterday by Lavrov, have not given any indication that they're willing to agree to that. But the second point in regards to Syria is that the Syrian regime is much more entrenched than any of the other regimes that I've talked about ever were. And that is, we've not really seen, remember in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, immediately we saw, after the uprising gained some traction, that parts of the military started to peel away from the regimes. We've not seen that in Syria at all. The military is still very, very strong, and we've seen very, very minor figures defecting, but nothing at all like what we saw in Egypt, like what we saw particularly in Libya also. And so I think the outcome in Syria is likely to be a protracted civil war. And, for all practical purposes, the country is already in a civil war. Certainly the destruction is that of a civil war. The number of deaths already estimated in Syria is close to 40,000 with no end in sight. So this will probably be the bloodiest of all of the countries that I've talked to you about this afternoon. Now let me also say a word about some countries where we've seen kind of glimmerings of revolutions in the Arab world, but they have not been successful. And that is particularly Bahrain, and also the rest of the Arab Gulf states. And so one of the big questions always that is asked to me is, why is it that this was successful in Egypt and so on, and all of the other countries I've talked to you about, but why was it not successful in some of the Arab Gulf countries? And the reason, I think, or at least the major reason, the way that I think about it, is simply money. And that is, these are very, very rich countries that have the ability to essentially pay their people off. Now Bahrain is slightly different. In Bahrain, again, you have Shiites against Sunnis. Again, it's a minority regime that has been in power for a long time. But remember that as soon as it looked as if the Bahraini government may have been even a tiny little bit in trouble, that the Saudis across the causeway between Saudi Arabia and Bahrain, send in their own troops to defend the regime in power in Bahrain. In all of the other countries in the Arab Gulf, what we've seen is that all of the governments, and you should remember that when I say governments in the Arab Gulf, I'm really talking about royal families. All 6 of the countries in the Arab Gulf, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, and so on and so forth, Kuwait and so on. All of these are really run by families, and so if you think of the family in Bahrain, you think of the Thanis, if you think of the Saudis, of Saudi Arabia, of course you talk about the Saudi family is the only country, I think, still named after a family actually in the world. And so these are very, very relatively tiny groups of people that have dominated these political systems for a very, very long time. Now, to give you kind of an idea of when I say, they hand out money to their people in a sense to keep them quiet, the first one to do so was Qatar. And Qatar is this very, very tiny country, incredibly rich, because it's now the 2nd largest natural gas producer in the world. And Qatar, when it saw these difficulties coming down the pipe, one morning the Sheikh of Qatar announced that every man, woman, and child in Qatar was entitled to roughly $3,300, just kind of as a handout, for whatever they wanted to do. Now, there's roughly 300,000 Qataris, so you do the math. This is a good chunk of change. but nothing compared, for example, to what Saudi Arabia did. Saudi Arabia is estimated, since the uprising in the Arab Gulf started, to have spent probably close to $100 billion on handouts to its population. So in a sense, it's this kind of the flowing of money within these political systems that has been used very, very effectively, I think, to keep these populations quiescent. And indeed, I would argue that particularly in the Arab Gulf, we will likely not see the kind of political movements that we've seen in the rest of the Arab world. Now, the big question, of course, is where are these revolutions heading? First of all, I should say I don't really think of these as revolutions. This has been the kind of the popular name that the press has assigned to what has happened in the Middle East. As I said, if you think back to the history, about the history of the Middle East, these kind of upheavals we've seen from time to time. As a matter of fact, people like Nasser really emerged out of a revolution against the colonial powers, and even during the colonial periods, there were lots of revolutions against the colonial masters at the time. So this is not new. What is new, of course, is the fashion in which it was fought, in which these revolutions were fought. Certainly, we had never seen as many young people involved. Certainly, we'd never seen as many women involved. Certainly, we'd never seen as many groups within civil society involved. So certainly, there was kind of a popular aspect to these revolutions that we've never seen. When I say that, when I talk about popular revolutions, immediately I think in your mind that it perhaps brings a question to mind as well. If it's popular, how organized is this really? How long-lasting can it be? And hence why I'm a little bit reluctant to call these revolutions, because when I think of a revolution, I think of the overthrow of a political system that will really introduce lasting social and political and often economic change in a country. And frankly, even in the very best case so far that we've seen in the Arab world, I don't think we've really seen that kind of thoroughgoing reform. We've seen some movement forward in Tunisia. Tunisia has had elections. Interestingly enough, a man that I interviewed 25 years ago, before he was pushed out into the wilderness, in the political wilderness, had to leave the country physically, Mr. al-Ghanouchi, the Islamist, is now back with his political party, and as you know, the Islamists now control the parliament in Tunisia. The same is about to happen, or was about to happen, I should say, in Egypt. And so, in a sense, what I'm trying to convey is that these are popular uprisings. Certainly the Islamists have played a very important role and will continue to play a very important role as they kind of sense their own power emerging in the chaos that a lot of these political systems are still subject to. But in the end, I think, I'm not sure that we're actually going to see an enormous amount of lasting change within the region. Yes, Tunisia, for all of the reasons that I've mentioned, in part of because of this history that goes back to Bourguiba and so on, is really better set up, institutionally better set up, to really adopt some of the reforms that the young people and even some of the politicians now want. Egypt, as I said just a few days ago, really took a giant step backwards, and certainly you cannot talk at all about a revolution in Egypt. Now, the interesting point is that I think the country that looked the most unpromising at the beginning, and that is Libya, again, because it had no history of state building, it had no history of really being a unified country in any sense beyond, being officially, the country called Libya. It's interesting that in that kind of situation, we may actually well see the emergence of what I think could well become the most successful example of reform in the Arab world. And I wouldn't be surprised if eventually in Libya, despite all the chaos that still exists, we're starting to see all kinds of very interesting examples of where the government very slowly is gaining traction in Libya, is able to create some institutions. The ministries are back open, the school systems have been invigorated in Libya. daily life is back to normal. And so it's very interesting that this country that looked like the absolute basket case, in part, I think, because it had nothing to build on, has been able to really move forward as rapidly as it has. Certainly, myself, if you would have asked me a year ago, could you even think of a scenario where Libya would go to national elections? If you would have asked me a year ago, I certainly would have said, absolutely impossible. But here we are. Roughly a year after the Libyan revolution started, already moving toward elections, already putting into place a committee that will then write a constitution for a country that has never had a constitution under the Muammar al-Gaddafi regime. So here we see, very interestingly, some real traction for a government and movement forward, and hopefully, obviously, the elections in Libya will again move the country even further along. For the other ones, again, I'm not, certainly for Syria, as I've expressed to you, I'm quite pessimistic. I don't see this as in any way as reforming a political system, and whatever political system emerges post-Assad, and I think it's inevitable in the long run that Assad will be removed, certainly will probably not carry any greater legitimacy than the Syrians have. So to go back to that sentence I used, the title from Pete Seeger, "Where Have All the Flowers Gone?" My argument would be that we've seen relatively little flowers in this uprising in the Arab world. We've seen some small changes, certainly. Tunisia has moved forward a little bit. Libya, as I said, may move forward and really become kind of the pays pilote that Tunisia ever was. But in Egypt and Syria and the remainder of the Arab Gulf, we've seen very little actual change. In Morocco, kind of at the far west of the Arab world, again, is slightly different in part because there the monarchy, remember that the king of Morocco comes from a monarchy that dates its ancestry back all the way to the Prophet Muhammad, is a dynasty that has been in power for almost 4 centuries, and so it has a lot more legitimacy, and it also has had, and it's something we don't tend to talk about a lot in the Arab world, it has had a lot better leadership. One crucial element in all these revolutions, what we've not really seen, except perhaps a little bit in Tunisia and in Libya, has really been good leadership. Morocco, for all of the bad points about the monarchy, at least has had a leadership that was willing to reform even before the popular reforms in the rest of the Arab world started. So it's a moderate, is the glass half full, is the glass half empty? In my estimation, it will really depend. It's too early to answer this yet. Again, these kind of popular upheavals take years, if not decades, to really kind of throw off fruit, so to speak, to really lead to actual results. But I think it's probably fair to say that this set of Arab revolutions that we've seen over the last 2 years will probably prove to be much like some of the earlier ones that we saw in the 1950s and the 1960s. The only kind of counter argument that you could make is that these countries have now become opened up a lot more to globalization. Certainly, social media played an enormous role in what happened, particularly in Egypt, to some extent also in Libya, certainly also in Tunisia, so that the dynamics, the internal dynamics of these countries are changing willy-nilly no matter what, and that in the end may also contribute to change. So my evaluation overall is kind of a cautiously pessimistic one, I think. I don't think we've really seen major change. A lot of the systems, if Egypt indeed is a harbinger of what is coming down the pike for some of the other countries, certainly it will not be seen as a major upheaval in the modern politics of the Middle East that has emerged since these countries became independent in the 1950s. Let me stop there maybe and open it up for questions. Please, yes, in the back.
You say that Assad is almost certain to lose power sooner or later. And my question is whether that will really make any difference, because Bashar was not the first choice of Hafiz al-Assad to be his successor. And he has met with members of the opposition since the uprising began, and made promises that he did not fulfill. And it seems to me he may be a prisoner of his own clan, and the generals, the head of the security services and the army, who are also Alawite, may be behind him and propping him up, and at some point they'll cut him loose, but yeah, I'm not sure that'd make any difference.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. And indeed, it's, one of the really big problems in Syria is that lots of people are actually thinking along the lines that you think. That is, in a sense, we tend to focus on Bashar al-Assad at this particular point in time. But certainly, he'll probably go eventually. But the problem will remain. And the problem remains that core of Alawites around the family and himself that is very, very closely linked to the most powerful part of the Syrian military. So replacing, and it's in a sense, it's a very Western way of thinking, because we're so used to thinking that the president is kind of the pinnacle of power in the political system. We tend to think that that is so in other political systems also. And so if the president is removed, in our political system, you bring in new, if the Democrats lose, the Republicans bring in a new administration, and so that's simply not the way things work, obviously, in the Middle East. So even if Bashar were to go, that, as you, I think, very correctly expressed, does not necessarily mean that we're going to see any change. And in part, I think that's what the Russians also realize. The Russians have repeatedly said on a number of occasions, the problem here is not Assad. The problem really is this political system and this political clan that holds power. And so if you remove Assad, essentially you're going to end up with the same political system minus Assad. And so, again, why I think it's so intractable, because it's very clear for the military in Syria that they have absolutely nothing to lose. If they were to lose this popular battle, it's against the wall for them. There's no barrier at all, no buffer between them and the population. And hence, I think, why they are so adamant to continue this struggle despite the enormous loss of life that we're starting to see. And imagine if that regime were to fall, if you kind of follow what has happened, for example, in Egypt and Libya, where we now have these kind of beginnings of reconciliation committees and so on that are started, after enormous amounts of revenge that have taken place. Imagine what that would be like in Syria, where you have this regime that's intensely hated by most of the population, that isn't a minority regime. It doesn't only touch the military, it doesn't only touch the Assad family and the cronies around the Assad family, and it really touches the Alawites as a group, and the Shiites really as a group as well. So it's a much deeper problem than simply removing Assad, although again we in the West tend to think it's the one demand that particularly the United States keeps making. We want to see Assad removed. Hillary Clinton has been saying it on at least half a dozen occasions that I've seen. Well, that is not really the problem. It's like you said, there's much more around Assad than simply him and his family. Please, yes.
Two questions. They're quite different, but they have a common denominator, which is the impact on US foreign policy. Firstly, could you give us your views about what happened in Yemen, which is another place where there has been upheaval, and that has an impact on foreign policy as far as Al-Qaeda in Yemen.
Right.
And secondly, although the Egyptian military has not yet lost its power, the fact is it is going to put its constitution to a referendum. What, in your view, is the stability of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty?
Yeah. On Yemen, first of all, Yemen is really a unique country in that it truly is still a tribal society in many ways. And particularly, we saw this under the reign of Abdullah Saleh, who, of course, because of his military connections, his tribal connections, was able, for a long, long period, in a little bit reminiscent of Libya, although in Libya the tribes weren't that important. In Yemen, tribal affiliation until today. Remember, if you even today, if you travel in parts of Yemen, You may have to pay for a permit by one of the local tribes to pass through their territory. I mean, a centralized government doesn't really exist totally in Yemen. And so that makes it very, very difficult. The angle, of course, that you were asking me about is the United States. And Yemen has become, particularly with the countries around it, and virtually, if you kind of look at I don't have a map here, but if you look at a map of the Arabian Peninsula and you go all the countries, all the way from Djibouti and over into Yemen and then all the way Oman and around, these are that whole littoral part of that waterway is completely occupied by U.S. military installations. So it's a crucial part of the world for us, and part, of course, because of the Straits of Hormuz, where all the oil needs to go through. And so Yemen is very important because there really is the ability of a very well organized terrorist movement, Al-Qaeda in this particular case, to really destabilize the country. And what that means is that, in a sense, what you would have, frankly speaking, would be something like Afghanistan, where different tribes are supporting different groups, where perhaps some of the tribes support the equivalent of, the Taliban in Afghanistan, different name, of course, in Yemen. And so, as you know, because of that, and because that's the kind of scenario that is believed in Washington at this particular point in time, we've been very, very forceful in supporting the Saleh regime, even though, we were also instrumental in kind of pushing them to the side. But we certainly see Yemen, much like we saw Afghanistan, a few years ago, as kind of a linchpin in this struggle against radical Islamism. And of course, the big danger would be if the regime falls and if the tribes kind of start, if the country in itself really becomes lawless. And if you know a little bit about Yemen, that is not such a far out scenario. This is a country that has had civil war either almost constantly, or even when the civil war was settled, there was still a lot of infighting between the tribes and so on. This is a country much like Libya, where virtually anybody who wants to can get a weapon. There's a lot of weapons being smuggled in Yemen, where weapons are very cheap. I was in Sa'ada in Yemen last year, which is about an hour north of Sana'a, the capital. You could get an AK-47 for about $100 on the open market. So if you're talking about those kinds of situations, you're talking about a very, very unstable country that could really go either way. Now, the really, really big question here is whether our intervention, meaning the United States intervention, the United States help, can really help stabilize this country, or if in the long run it is simply going to be evolved the way that Afghanistan did, where, despite the enormous expense that we've done, the enormous involvement that we've had, when we leave Afghanistan, Afghanistan will be virtually back to where it was when we came in, with the Taliban slowly taking over again. So that's the big issue on Yemen. Sorry, the other question was on
the Egyptian-Israel peace treaty.
Ah, yes. Everyone so far in Egypt has really, whether it's the Islamists, whether it's the more secular parties, the major policymakers, so far everybody has paid lip service to the Camp David agreements and have said that those need to be maintained. Although, as you're probably all aware, that kind of automatic support has wavered a little bit over the last few months. The Islamists in particular, have kind of started to make some noises that, unconditional support is perhaps too much. So I think in part why these elections in Egypt and the constitution and so on is going to be very important. My hunch is there's going to be a lot of unrest and unease about the constitution, particularly if the military wants to push their own constitution through. But the big battle here, in a sense, really is over whether or not the Islamists become the dominant force in Egyptian politics or not. If they do, then I think it's unavoidable that what we'll see between Israel and Egypt will be kind of a cold peace, to put it kind of in the traditional terminology. That is, they will probably stick to the agreement, in part because if they don't, they lose all kinds of international aid and standing and so on, but certainly not a very supportive attitude. If it would be the non-religious people who gain, then I think we'd probably see a more warm support. Neither one, I think, will abolish that relationship with Israel, but it certainly wouldn't be a very warm one if the Islamists gain a greater power. Please, yes.
You mentioned Lebanon, Jordan.
Yeah, sure. Lebanon, poor Lebanon, just as it kind of finds its own feet, just as the government is gaining quite a bit of traction, you have the conflict next door. And for those of you who remember how, if you think Syria is complicated with the different ethnic groups and the sectarian divide and so on, Lebanon, is 10 times worse in a sense. And remember that Lebanon has had several civil wars, and that Syria was actually very closely involved in one of those civil wars, and as a matter of fact occupied Lebanon until it was asked to leave, but still has a large presence, particularly among the more radical Islamists in Lebanon, that Syria has kept supporting kind of as a spoiler to maintain its influence in Lebanon. So one of the big worries is that the instability in Syria will eventually spill over into Lebanon. And the Lebanese, and particularly the government, have been gone to great lengths to try to avoid that, have made all kinds of statements. Lebanon is Lebanon now, it's no longer tied to Syria and so on. But if that instability in Syria continues, and particularly if that instability would lead to weapons transfers, for example, from Syria into Lebanon, there's already a little bit of evidence that that is happening, then you could very well see that particularly some of the Islamist groups would get armed very heavily, could upset the balance, and so we could eventually, and I realize that this is still quite far off, but we could eventually see the resurgence of kind of a civil war in Lebanon as well. I don't think personally it's going to come to that, and think in part because the government has already put into action a number of political initiatives that give more power to some of the disaffected groups and so on. But nevertheless, stability in Syria is not good for stability in Lebanon. Jordan, very interesting, in part because in Jordan what you have is an enormous presence of Palestinians. And the dynamics, the political dynamics in Jordan have always been the Hashemites, the king, the royal family, in a sense keeping political power balanced between the native tribes and the Palestinians that make up, I think, up to roughly about 50% of the population. Jordan, of course, has a king that's very westernized in a sense, and has taken a number of initiatives to kind of prevent some of, again, economic handouts have been used and so on. But Jordan is not as rich as the Arab Gulf states, so that in a sense will come to an end also. And whether or not he will be able to keep playing that very careful balancing act that he's played so well until recently is still up in the air. The point is that if countries like big countries like Egypt and Syria catch a cold, it spills over sometimes into some of the other countries. So I think the jury's not out. Jordan, I think, has done very well so far. But I'm sure that the king is very, very carefully watching kind of the political dynamics and what is happening, whether or not some of these Palestinian groups are getting more radicalized and so on. We've seen some very interesting initiatives between the Israelis and the Jordanians in that regard to kind of make sure that political activism doesn't spill across the borders and so on. But it is a touchy situation for Jordan as well. Please, yes.
If you assume that a Sunni-dominated Syria would not be likely to be in line with Iran, why shouldn't that be our objective?
Well, I'm not even really sure what the objective is of the United States at this particular point in time. I've not really seen a clearly articulated policy yet. What the administration so far has said is, we want Assad gone, we want a more equal distribution of power and so on, but no one really seems to know what that means. Now, of course, if you would have a Sunni-dominated Syria, in principle, you would think that would be in our interest, right? Because you could then use the Sunnis against the Shiites in Iran. That assumes, of course, that the Sunnis in Syria would want to play our game. There's no real plan out there yet. And if indeed the Sunnis would become the majority, which I think is probably unlikely, but in the scenarios I see it is, in Syria we would probably get a coalition government more than anything else, because some of the groups, the Christians and so on, are not going to want to be left out either. But anyway, even a rise of the Sunnis, the power of the Sunnis, I think, should be in our interest. I'm just not sure that we could really harness them for our own. Remember that to us from the outside, we tend to think here in black and white a little bit. I think that is, that Iran is this kind of the big bad devil out there, and that all the people in the Middle East tend to think the way we do and see Iran in much the same image that we see it. And I'm not so sure that it's true. I think there's probably a lot of groups in the Middle East, perhaps including the Sunnis in Syria, I simply don't know, that may prove to be a lot more accommodationist toward Iran than we in the West would feel comfortable with.
You mentioned that you haven't yet seen a plan.
Right.
Is the absence of a plan strike you as being very alarming?
Yes, no. I mean, yes, it's the dog that doesn't bark, right? Absolutely. It means that, and I'm sure, Washington, off the record, has already come up with, or at least has thought this through, because they do play these exercises. But the fact that it has not been announced yet, I think more than anything else indicates that Washington doesn't see a clear way out of Syria yet, that it hasn't really decided yet, and that yes, the regime may go, but when is it going to go? What are the political dynamics? Syria is a very, very difficult country to analyze in a sense. And so my hunch is the fact that we haven't seen a plan has more to do with caution, not knowing which way this is going to go, rather than the fact that we don't have a plan yet. Yeah. Please, yes.
To what degree serves the current events a breakdown of all the constructors of Versailles and the Ottoman Empire, and its kind of Islam being replaced by what I personally call the desert fundamental Islam, which would combine with the underemployment of young people and so forth to a much stronger, broader movement. So that all of those things we've talked about, the tactical movements at this point, which lead to nothing, considering this wave that's coming.
Yeah, well, I mean, as the thing I was trying to kind of convey was that, in a sense, these are social movements, in a sense, and I don't think in the end they're going to be particularly powerful, but they certainly may have some impact. Certainly, the young people, the way that civil societies are being reorganized, with the help of social media. And I think it's very important. The role of women is going to be so all of this this truly is different from what we've seen before. But as you hinted at, the major change really has come in the Islamists in particular. And that is, these were movements. I mean, if you think of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, really goes back to the early 1920s with the Hassan al-Banna and so on. These have existed for a long, long time, but they've always existed underground. They've always been suppressed by the local regimes, in part because they were seen as a possible alternative to secular rule, that existed. And what was very interesting, of course, is that both the secular side and the Islamists always claimed the religion as being on their side. Now, even the secular figures, even Sadat, even Bourguiba and so on, brought up, kind of symbolically Islam time and time again. But what we're seeing now is that really for the first time, groups who subscribe very openly to Islam are becoming part of the political system. Now, this could have happened a while back. For example, at the end of the 1970s, the Al-Nahda movement in Tunisia, which was the movement headed by Rashid al-Ranouchi, called the Renaissance Party at the time, would have been the first possibility of bringing Islamic parties into the political framework in kind of North Africa. Egypt, I'm leaving out Egypt because there the Muslim Brotherhood was really suppressed. The second opportunity would have been Algeria in 1988, where it was very clear if the elections would have gone forward the way they were structured according to the country's constitution, and that the Algerian Islamists would have won a majority in parliament. On both occasions, very interestingly enough, the movements were suppressed, and were suppressed, let's call a spade with the aid of the West. We actively supported, in part, the suppression of these movements. So, it took another generation before these Islamists now come back, and believe me, some of these lessons are not lost. One of the main Islamists, for example, in Libya, who now has his, 2 weeks ago I was at the opening of his political party, the creation of his political parties, a man called Belhaj. Belhaj had been extradited by the United States via Egypt to Libya, where the Libyans, of course, tortured him. This man is now head of a political party in Libya. So, in a sense, what we couldn't do and what we tried until very recently is coming back to haunt us somewhat, I think, and it's coming back to haunt the West, and the Islamists will undoubtedly gain an enormous amount of power. The big issue is, however, it's not clear what the Islamic agenda is. There's lots of different political Islamist parties. There's the Salafis, which are much more hardline, and they're the kind of the reformists, as they call themselves. And my hunch is that, nothing is more prone to violence than interreligious violence between groups that belong to the same religion. And so my hunch is we'll probably see a lot of infighting within Egypt, within Libya, and so on, among these Islamist groups, rather than between the Islamists and the more secular parties. So I think that's the way it's going. But I think you're absolutely right. This is a big social movement that has been introduced that we can no longer stop it the way we did it a generation ago. So it is very important to think about. Please, yes.
And it sounds like your description of Syria is very similar to what Iraq was prior to our U.S. invasion of Iraq. And following what you were saying, get rid of the leader of Assad, not much is going to change. And we thought the same way with Iraq.
Yes.
With the rising of violence in Iraq, do you think that do you have a vision of what might be occurring in the near future?
In Iraq?
In Iraq.
Yes. Well, I mean, and I think your analogy was right on the mark. We stepped in when this was a political system, again, much like the Syrian system in a sense, that couldn't really be reformed. And because of our intervention, of course, it became reformed. But political systems, again, in the West, we tend to think that bringing aid, insisting on elections, talking about democracy, reforms essentially political systems. And certainly in some of the Western countries and so on, and that is true. But remember that in lots of Western countries, there's lots of time to do this. There's a tradition of citizenship and so on, all of which does not really exist in places like Iraq, for example. Again, this artificial creation. And so what I see happening in Iraq is, in a sense, I think Iraq's political system was really interrupted roughly in the 1950s, when the British were there and they imposed a political system that really didn't reflect what political reality was like at the time. And because of Saddam Hussein and so on, that kind of political system was held in abeyance, and it's coming back, in a sense. And what we're seeing, I think, is that although no one really except Joe Biden wants to say this publicly, I think what we're heading toward is probably in the long run a splitting up of the country. That is, if not de facto, at least kind of legally. We're already starting to see that the Kurds are looking for an oil pipeline to get their oil out without having to channel it by the central authorities of Iraq and so on. So, Kurdistan is probably going to go its own way. It's very, very sensitive, of course, because of the Kurds in the surrounding countries. But the Sunnis and the Shiites will probably also, in the long run, kind of create distinctly political and maybe even distinctly economic systems. So you could, and what that means is that you'll have to come up with a kind of, if you want to hold the country together, with a kind of a federal system. And that means that the constituent parts of that unit called Iraq would have almost equal rights. And the history of federalism in the Middle East in particular has, over the last century has not been very good. As a matter of fact, just about all the federal systems that existed, including the Libyan one, have really broken up over time, in part because they weren't really feasible. So my long-term vision for Iraq, unfortunately, is not terribly optimistic. Kind of reflects my view on a lot of other countries also. Thank you. Yes, please.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, sure.
How do you see the civil war in Syria impacting on Turkey and Israel?
Yeah, you know, Turkey is a very important country to watch, in part because, you know, Turkey has really kind of started to taste its own power, so to speak. You know, for a long time, it was kind of off on itself. It then tried to integrate itself with the European community, which is more or less, I think the Turks have realized, you know, this is not really going anywhere. So what the Turks have done, and I saw this very, very clearly when I was working as political advisor at the United Nations last summer, you know, they've kind of developed, I think, this understanding that really to become a great country again, and they're very, very ambitious in terms of how they want to participate in negotiations and so on, settlement. They were very active in the Libyan crisis also, for example. And I think they, in a sense, have really cast their eye eastward, Central Asia rather than Europe. And that's where I think they see their big future. You know, they're already again involved in all kinds of diplomatic initiatives there as well. So, you know, as part of that, I think, you know, you were specifically asking about the relationship between Turkey and Israel. Was that part of the question?
No.
Oh, sorry.
The impact of the civil war in Syria on Turkey, with so many refugees on the border, for example, and Israel, if there is any.
Frankly, I don't think there's going to be an enormous impact on Turkey. You know, they can handle this quite readily. Again, it's probably going to spur them on, if anything, to more diplomatic intervention and so on. What of course, and here we've seen a little bit of a worrying development, the Turks have made noises to the Syrians, you know, that the situation in the long run really is intolerable, that they do need to find a solution. But I cannot see a scenario under which, for example, Turkish troops, is that what you're thinking of, would actually enter Syria, unless, and here is the kind of big if, unless I would argue either the Arab League would ask them to do so, or the United Nations could reach a resolution that then allows Turkey to intervene. Then I think they would go in. But certainly they will not take a unilateral initiative in Syria. Israel, well, I mean, you know, there's two ways of looking at Israel. And, you know, on the one hand, any crisis in the Middle East kind of takes away the focus on Israel for a while. But on the other hand, it's quite clear that if you will have a major destabilization taking place in Syria, and at the same time you have Iran on the sidelines, you know, trying to cash in or trying to use its own power or whatever it has in Syria, you could really see kind of a major, very, very negative scenario for the Israelis at that time. And as we know, the Israelis are not afraid of you know, stating very publicly that they are willing to intervene by all means possible if necessary to make sure that some of these situations destabilize. I think they're still very, very preoccupied, and the debate inside Israel is still so preoccupied. As a matter of fact, it's becoming more and more preoccupied, which is, you know, this anti versus pro intervention in regard to Iran. So the Syria question is still. I was at a conference with some of the major Israeli thinkers on Syria at a conference in Korea a few weeks ago, and they essentially said the same thing. We're still too preoccupied really with Iran yet. Once that gets settled, you know, then we'll really, and from what I understand, and I'm not an expert in this, but from what I understand, from a strategic point of view, this is not a problem for Israel. And certainly if you're thinking about the Golan Heights and so on, this is not an issue, you know, for them.